I will never be awake past midnight again. I have a habit of staying on my cell phone after 11 o'clock, reading creepypastas and listening to horror podcasts. They rarely scare me, but they do fill my mind with unrealistic scenarios of entities, monsters, and murders. One Saturday night, when the whole neighborhood was already quiet, and I was the only person awake, I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, with my back to the dark corridor, listening to a horror story through my headphones. Suddenly, I heard a noise of something falling behind me. Quickly paused the story and looked back. Nothing, just the empty corridor, illuminated by the light from the bathroom. So I decided to go out and look in the direction where the noise seemed to have come from, my bedroom. I went into it and turned on the light. I wasn't scared, just worried that something had fallen and broken in there. But everything was normal, so I thought it was just my head or the story, and went back to doing what I was doing. When I finished, I went back to my room and put on my pajamas to go to bed. It was very late. I'd spent all night listening to horror podcasts while playing games, so I was quite sleepy. Until I noticed that the window was wide open, something that surprised me for a few seconds because I didn't remember opening the window. Well, since it was so hot, maybe I should have done it earlier and I didn't remember. I put on my pajamas, turned off the light, and went to bed. I scrolled through my social media feed for a few minutes before putting my cell phone on charge and turning it off. Then I woke up out of nowhere with a panicky feeling taking over my body. I quickly opened my eyes and a feeling of dread gripped my body as I looked towards the entrance to my room and saw a dark figure with only a white face, standing there and staring at me. My heart raced wildly, almost as if it was going to explode. The thing walked towards me, and the door closed on its own behind it, without the thing even putting its hand on it. Then the thing stops next to me and stares at me with those black orbs. On closer inspection, the creature must have been hooded, and looked more human, and its white face looked more like a mask now. I felt sweat beading on my forehead. Then something clicked in my mind. I remembered the stories I used to read, and how they filled my mind. It could only be a sleep paralysis, and the thing must have been an amalgam of everything I'd been imagining all day. And then, in the midst of the excitement caused by my relief, I abruptly moved my arm and leg, and the thing was still there. That's when I realized that I wasn't in sleep paralysis. I've been a trekker for years, traveling the long hauls between Portland and Fairbanks regularly. It's a journey that has become second nature to me. But on this particular night, things were different. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, and the harsh winds and relentless snowfall made the road treacherous on top of the rocky roads in the Yukon of Canada. I knew I had to find a safe place to park and wait out the storm, but there were no rest stops or gas stations in sight. Just as the last light of day disappeared, I saw a faintly glowing sign pointing to a truck stop a few miles ahead. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I turned onto the snow-covered road, hoping to find shelter and a hot meal. The road seemed endless, and the darkness was all-encompassing. The snowfall made it hard to see anything ahead, and I had to navigate with caution. As I finally approached the truck stop, it appeared almost ghostly, a rundown and isolated place tucked deep within the Yukon wilderness. Only a couple of other trucks were parked there, adding to the eerie silence that surrounded the place. Upon entering the truck stop, I immediately sensed an unsettling atmosphere. The dim lighting and the musty smell made the place feel strangely haunting. The old man behind the counter acknowledged me with a nod, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of unspoken stories and experiences. Despite my gut feeling, I decided to grab a quick bite to eat and then huddle in my truck for the night. As the storm raged on outside, I struggled to find sleep. The noises of the storm seemed to take on a life of their own. Whispers carried by the wind, creaking sounds from the nearby woods, and eerie laughter that seemed to come from nowhere. Tried to dismiss these unsettling feelings as mere products of exhaustion, but as the night wore on, they only grew stronger. The radio became my lifeline, my connection to the outside world. Yet, all I heard were cryptic messages and distorted voices, making me feel even more isolated and on edge. As the clock neared midnight, just as I was starting to drift into a restless slumber, a tapping sound on my truck window jolted me awake. My heart raced as I peered outside, but the storm made it nearly impossible to see anything clearly. Tried to convince myself that it was just a tree branch or an animal seeking shelter. Then, a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the surroundings for a brief moment, and I saw a shadowy figure slowly walking by my truck. Fear gripped me, and I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help. But there was no signal, and the figure stopped about 2 feet away from the door, sending chills down my spine. To my horror, more ghostly silhouettes emerged from the darkness. Their glowing eyes and unnaturally fluid movements terrified me. I locked the doors, hoping to keep them at bay. With trembling hands, tried to start the engine and escape this nightmare. You know when somebody is running from danger in a horror film, and they get to a vehicle and the engine decides to stall out. Yeah, that happened to me here. I was trapped with these otherworldly beings pressing against the windows, their haunting faces close enough to touch. Faint whispers grew louder, filling the cab with an eerie presence. I grabbed a flashlight, hoping its beam could offer some protection. To my shock, I realized these apparitions were not human at all. They were something far darker and malevolent. It seemed like they thrived on fear. In a state of terror, I retreated to the bunk of the truck, clutching a wrench for any semblance of safety. I held on tight, praying for the storm to subside and the morning light to break the spell. Yet the night felt interminable, and reality blurred with horrifying visions. As the first rays of dawn finally pierced the storm clouds, the ghostly figures retreated back into the forest, leaving no trace behind. The wind and snow subsided, and I mustered the courage to step out of my truck, my heart still pounding from the night's terrors. As I approached the truck stop, it was in ruins, as if abandoned for years. The old man was nowhere to be found, and an eerie emptiness lingered. I couldn't explain what I had witnessed, but I knew I had to leave immediately. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent lurked in the Yukon wilderness. I kept this harrowing experience to myself, fearing that others might dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. Yet deep within, I knew that something inexplicable and sinister had taken place on that fateful night in the Yukon. I vowed to never stop driving until I reached the safety of Fairbanks, leaving the haunting memories of that cursed truck stop behind me forever. Aaron was a bullshitter. Everyone in our class knew it. Even at the age of 10, you could see the wild imagination in his eyes, writing his stories midway through telling them. His dad knew the president and his uncle was in the rocket that went to the moon, but he doesn't like having his photos taken so you won't recognize him from anywhere. It was fun not believing but indulging him. I spent every school year with him following that enjoyment. But there was something different in those eyes when he spoke about the Midnight Man. Lack of the imagination the rest of his tales required. He said he first saw him whilst disobeying his bedtime orders, glancing at the vacant sidewalk through his bedroom window. He's just like, weird. He has one of those big foreheads like Daniel's dad, and one eyebrow that's as long as two. He wears a coat like mine, but it's black. Aaron gestured to his red cagoule, and ignored Daniel's sulking that began after his dad's receding hairline got used as a description. I can sprint to your house in like 23 seconds, and I never saw him. Daniel snarled at him. That's because you go to bed early. He only goes walking at nighttime 12. Like midnight. He must be the Midnight Man. Aaron blurted out at the surrounding gang, darting his eyes around to see if we all looked on board with his story. We all just stared in silence, which was the usual cue for him to continue. He didn't see me, but he stopped and was looking at my house. He had loads of rings on one hand like bikers have, but he didn't have a bike. My brother could have beat him up anyway since he was staying at our house, and he was the strongest Marine in his squadron and helped Obama kill Bin Laden. He says I'm already stronger than most of the guys he trained with. We all giggled and resorted back to the usual teasing that occurs whenever Aaron goes on such tangents. But I could tell we all shared the same curiosity about the Midnight Man. We all left the playground with the agreement that Aaron and Daniel would stay up until midnight to see if they both spot the Midnight Man. If not, Aaron had to be in goal when we played soccer during tomorrow's recess. "You need to stay up too," Aaron pointed at me. "Why do I have to stay up?" "Because he walks the same way me and Daniel did when we went to your mom's barbecue at your house. And if he breaks Daniel's door down and punches him to death with his biker rings, you need to tell everyone I was right." Daniel shot a look of mildly frustrated betrayal at his involuntary sacrifice. "Fine," I said, and with that, we were all going home to look out for Aaron's Midnight Man. It took me a good minute just to get to my bedroom window from my bed. My mom and dad always went to bed late, and the plan was ruined if they knew I'd stayed up. I turned my own TV off when they told me to, but kept my Xbox on, so as soon as I pressed the television remote power button, my Xbox messages screen reappeared so I could talk to Aaron and Daniel. The sound was all the way down, so I quietly moved my analog stick to type a message from my windowsill. Once the time read 23:55 p.m. Waiting now. I squatted down, so only my nose and above was visible from the street, and I stared into the night. Nothing moved but the gentle sway of tree branches and bushes in the summer breeze. I played Aaron's story back over in my head, and felt a faint burning of nerves in my stomach, which slowly faded as the boredom set in. I was thinking about getting back in bed and messaging Aaron to tell him he's in goal tomorrow by 05. Then I saw the glow of my TV shift as a message from XX_Ninjaran_Fix came through. He's back. The nerves returned, but I reassured myself that Aaron isn't the one I need confirmation from. Daniel's message is the one that makes it real. I mentally noted that I'd give it until 0:20. The nerves weren't fading this time. It felt like I was checking the time every half an hour just to see it unchanged or only a minute later. I wished there was a way to hide even more of myself from the world outside the glass. I was begging to see Daniel's gamer tag pop up on my screen. I glanced back over at my TV, but before my brain could even register the time, I heard him. Faint but audible thud of shoes hitting the sidewalk was growing closer, bouncing around midnight silence. As I lowered my head further until I could barely see the street, I saw him. Aaron's description was uncanny. A tall man in all black marched past my house and began slowing in pace as he reached the path leading to our porch. His hands were in his pockets as his legs began moving too slowly to even propel him forward. He stared towards our front door, then began scanning the garden, his movement matching a corpse's from the neck down. I kept my eyes fixed on his hands to try and catch a glimpse of his rings. By the time I went back to study his face, his emotionless gaze, shadowed by a thick monobrow, was climbing up to my bedroom window. I lost my nerve and dropped out of sight, trying to keep my breathing quiet. Pleaded with the universe to end the peace I was happy to endure just minutes ago, until I heard the thud of his shoes continue and waited before slowly resuming my hidden stance by the windowsill. He was out of sight. All that was left to suggest he was even there in the first place was the faint swishing of a moving cagoule sinking back into the soft wind and darkness. I stared out a few seconds longer until I was startled by a flicker of light coming from my muted TV. Danny B63 messaged, "He's real and I think he saw me." Aaron was cockily slumped in his chair like a king as Daniel told a group of kids what he saw when I got to class the next day. He's like that robot guy with the European accent in those movies my dad watches. He saw it too. Daniel pointed at me, joined the excited rambling, and watched my classmates' faces jump between terror and enfeeblement as I described whoever it was that turned my warm summer night into an eerie horror intro. Some other boys said they were gonna start staying up for the Midnight Man too. The teacher ordered us all to our seats, and before I could empty my pencil case, Daniel leaned over from his desk and spoke in a tone much more quiet and disturbed than the one he'd just been spitting all around the classroom. "Did you see his monster eyes?" Shook my head. It was like he was mad at us or something. The teacher's bellows began overpowering Daniel's whispers. Despite the giddiness the Midnight Man gave Aaron and Daniel, I had a strong urge to never force myself awake for such a reason again. An urge that was drowning in the certainty that as long as midnight returns, the man would too, and his visits wouldn't go without a witness. Some other boys began joining what we'd call hunting the Midnight Man night, despite said nights just being us hiding behind our curtains and windowsills. Most nights I wouldn't even stay up. I'd just say I did. I didn't like the feeling the Midnight Man gave me when I felt his presence near my home. That cold, pale face and those stiff strides made me feel a way nothing else of this world could. During spring break, we'd all stay up late gaming together, and you felt the brink of tomorrow drop its shade of black when someone mentioned midnight approaching. We'd nervously joke through those distant thuds, and that's all it became after a while. By the time we all started high school, the mysterious and mythical became the homeless and or mentally ill. The Midnight Man became more of an inside joke we'd rarely make the effort to crack, let alone hunt. The only thing regarding him that remained unchanged over the years was the severity in which Daniel spoke about him with. Sometimes it felt like we were making jokes about God in front of a Christian. He never breached the subject but would go somber if anyone else did, and would only speak to retell all his sightings of the Midnight Man without a shred of humor in his voice. Me and Aaron stayed pretty good friends, but we grew apart from Daniel. Maybe that was one of the reasons why. By the time we had reached 16, Daniel had moved across the country with his family. Something to do with his dad's job. Just remember fist bumping him on his last day and seeing his car go past my house as he drove away from the past 16 years of his life, leaving mine and Aaron's without him from that day forward. The Daniel we knew when we were 10 was nowhere to be found in the Daniel who drove down my road that day. I could tell Aaron was saddened by his leaving, because he'd constantly bring up old times and ask me to start my Xbox up again to play with him, a hobby I'd left behind once I hit 13. It now sat under my desk, gathering dust, probably with thousands of game invites from him and Daniel over the past 3 years, all unanswered. Mine and Aaron's friendship was never awkward, but like a lot of teenagers, we just began meeting new friends and going to parties and hanging out without each other. There was always a seat for him next to me and vice versa, but time slowly turned him into a face I'd acknowledge whilst passing in the halls. We shared a hug when we both graduated high school and had a drunken, reminiscent talk at the after party where we brought up his bullshit stories from all those years ago, how we should both find our Xboxes again, the Midnight Man antics, and where we think Daniel and other kids from our class had and would end up. That was the last time I spoke to Aaron. 10 years have passed now, and despite the love I still have for him, I would happily accept that as the end of our story in exchange for eradicating the bubbling dread that has since nested within me. Unexpectedly lost my job 2 weeks ago, and immediately made the decision to mentally tie myself to my desk with my laptop and phone in front of me, barely moving to eat or sleep, but regularly doing so to grab another beer and extinguish the anxiety regarding my next bill payment. Ad after ad, phone call after phone call. I began speaking in a mental script, only communicating to pursue a wage and begging fate to give me an opportunity. After 2 days, it must have been the 20th time I refreshed my email to see I'd received another automated chunk of text stating my application was unsuccessful, and all the suppressed frustration since getting laid off left my body. I swiped my laptop and phone off of my desk counter, launched an empty bottle at the wall, and stormed out of the room to my bedroom. I opened the window, lit a cigarette, and inspected the night, wondering what the hell went so wrong so fast. I'd been bound to my desk so long that I didn't even realize it was dark out. I was watching the smoke disappear into the void of the sky when I looked down to see a man 3 stories below me walking past the small patch of grass just before the sidewalk outside my building. I watched in confusion as he slowly came to a halt and began examining the bricks. I saw his head freeze when it reached my window, and I was in too bad of a mood to break the glare first. We stared at each other in silence, and I raised the 2 fingers I was using to grip my cigarette to acknowledge his presence. He kept staring. I gave him a puzzled nod, unsure anymore if he even knew he was looking at someone. He kept staring. "You all right there, buddy?" Shouted into the night. He kept staring. My eyes were beginning to adjust to the darkness, and I started studying his face. His severely receding hairline, that thick monobrow, the pale complexion and gaunt look. Those monster eyes. My mind began whirling around the pillars that held up the part of my brain that stored those childhood memories, and just as some ancient nerves caught fire in my stomach again, I saw the sparkle of silver wrapped around the fingers of one of his hands as he removed it from his pocket and began making his way towards the building's entrance. My hands went numb, and the cigarette landed in his path. I heard the thud of his boots as he stepped on it before disappearing below me. I staggered away from the window like a hit soldier and dashed back to my desk where my phone lied underneath, resting on a damaged laptop. I went to dial 911 and saw the time as I scrambled to work my phone. 03. The operator asked my emergency, but my breath and words were sucked out of my lungs when I heard the clink of rings clutching the metal rails of my building's stairs 3 stories down. "Hello? Do you have an emergency?" The swishing of a cagoule was joined by the thud of thick boots as the clanging grew louder. Slowly lowered the phone from my ear, ignoring the faint questioning of the operator. The noises ceased, and in the hallway light that seeped under the crack of my door, I saw the shadow of 2 feet waiting in dead stillness outside my home. They didn't budge an inch. It was like an empty pair of shoes rather than human limbs. I couldn't bring myself to make any sudden movements, and the phone in my limp arm felt like it was a mile journey from my face. I mustered up all the energy I could find the guts to use and clicked the speaker button on my phone with my thumb. "Is everything all right? Do you need an ambulance?" Bursted out of my phone, and I felt the vibration from the volume. One shadow disappeared, shortly followed by the other. The thudding began vanishing, and the clanging disappeared with the same urgency it arrived with. I shivered in the silence for a few seconds before collapsing onto the floor, allowing my body to fold into the fetal position. I began crying uncontrollably. He was the exact same. It was 18 years later, and the clothes, the face, and those emotionless eyes were the exact same. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" My terror was replaced with confusion for less than a second. "Everything is fine. Sorry," I whispered, doing a poor job of fighting the shake in my voice before hanging up the phone. I didn't want the police. I didn't want it to feel real. I wanted to run 1,000,000 miles away and forget who I was and what I was going through. My thoughts ricocheted off of the inside of my head, and images I hadn't seen for 18 years flashed before my eyes. In the midst of chaotic panic, my mind acknowledged a question from all those years ago I could finally answer differently. "Did you see his monster eyes, Daniel?" Didn't know who or where Daniel was anymore, and I hadn't lived in the state that we started this in since I was in my early 20s. All I knew was he saw what I just did long before I had to, and he lived with it. I wasn't thinking logically anymore. There wasn't any logic in a situation like this. I knew what I was going to do, whether it made sense or not. I had to do something. I grabbed my wallet, my keys, my beers, and a kitchen knife on the way out. I set up the directions for an old address on my GPS and started the engine. I knew finding Daniel was hopeless. I'd search for him and many other old classmates on social media yearly. Nothing ever came up, but there was one more way back into the life I'd forgotten about. I leaned on my dashboard and remembered seeing Oren's parents at his graduation, telling them I hope their son ends up someplace great. I made 2 quick prayers, one begging that they haven't moved and the other hoping that wherever they send me to find their son, it was much greater for him than the place I'll be dragging him back to. With that, I pulled out of my building's parking lot with adrenaline in my veins, alcohol in my system, and the swishing of a kagul in my head. Have you ever hitchhiked before? If you did, then I have to say that you are really a fearless person. In my case, I rarely did that even before I bought my own car, cause I found it the most ineffective way for traveling. I couldn't understand why so many people chooses to travel in this embarrassing and dangerous way, and some crazy driver can kindly accept these strangers to sit in their car for a free ride. I never thought that one day I would stood on the side of a highway and hitchhike for once more. However, sometimes the reality is even worse than your worst imagination. I went to visit a friend that day. I set off at 6 in the afternoon, and it was already 11:30 p.m. when I sit in my car again and started to drove home. I found something wrong with the car cause I heard a strange sound when I started the engine, but I ignored it and just kept driving. I was expecting to arrive home at about 2:00 a.m. The highway was just the same as I came, stretched out flat and straight ahead, and the figure of the forest beside the road is in the midst of darkness like it was covered with a black veil. The classical music in my speaker flew smoothly inside the car. Suddenly, everything stopped. The music, the engine, the headlight, everything stopped at one moment. I realized that my car has broken down on the middle of my journey, on this part of the highway which has to take an hour's drive to go to the nearest town. I cursed everything I could have blamed while trying to get the car back to work again, but soon I knew that my attempt was in vain. I reached for my phone, opened my bag, and was confused for one moment. Shit! I left it in my friend's house. What should I do now? It's impossible for me to walk back home at 12:16 a.m. along a highway in the wild forest. I realized that there are no other options. Only one thing that I can do. 10 minutes later, and I was still standing on the highway. The wind was howling, leaking my exposed skin, taking away the heat from my body. Dim light of the street lamp spread smoothly on me, but still couldn't drive away the fear and cold brought by darkness. The only thing I can expect is that someone would drive on this highway at the middle of the night and was kind enough to help a young lady get back home. Didn't know how long I waited. I was just standing, hoping to see the headlight of a car. Wind was still howling, sneering at me with its low and powerful voice. I began to stretch my legs and arms to prevent them from getting numb, but that didn't work. The light was twisting in my eyes, made me want to sleep, draining all the rest of my heat and sanity. Then the light appeared. It came out from the edge of the highway. At first I considered it as my illusion, but soon I recognized that this light was the thing I always expected, and it's the only chance for me to escape from here. Dragged myself to the highway, stood in the way of that car. Thought that I would stop it whatever it costs. I would rather to die in a car accident than to be killed by the cold. I could see that the car is getting closer. The headlight was not very bright, only a little bit brighter than the streetlight. I was still standing there, waving my arms, giving my signal to the driver. Apparently that the driver had seen me. The car's speed decreased, and eventually stopped right in front of me. After a few seconds of silence, I heard a low but soft voice of a man. "Get in." I froze. What? I thought. I never thought that it would be so easy. I've prepared for anything to happen when I stood in his way, and now this is far easier than I expected. I could feel his words like an order, rather than a suggestion, which made me a little bit uncomfortable. However, like I said, I had no choice. All I could do is to get in the car with a polite thanks. It took me about 10 seconds to realize that the back seat is actually a safer choice for me. But the car was already moving when I had this thought, so I didn't say anything. The air conditioner was on. Heat filled this small space. It was such a pleasant thing to have heat back to my body again. I could feel that it came from my legs at first. I was able to feel my toes again. Seconds later, I found that the warm air came from everywhere. There was no reason for me to refuse it, so I just relaxed and let it enter my body. I closed my eyes and almost suddenly fell into sleep. It was a peaceful dream, until a scream ripped the sweet and quiet atmosphere into pieces. The scream was so despair and filled with the original fear of mankind. The most important thing is that sound was so familiar to me. It was my voice. That night was a nightmare to me forever. Now I could remember our conversation, every single word, every movement of him and me. It's like it just happened in yesterday. I woke up at once and almost fell off my seat. Had a bad dream? He asked, in a soft and restful voice. Yes, I replied. You only slept for 3 minutes and 25 seconds. It took me a few seconds for me to realize what he just said. Why were you counting that? I was trying to find something interesting to say. It may a long journey for both you and me. His strange behavior alerted me. I still didn't say anything, but at that moment I was already building my psychological defenses. Why you turned off the lights? The light blinded me, and you may understand if you drive. I understand. Good. Now we have the basic trust we may need. By the way, I never turned off anything. At that moment I suddenly realized that the streetlights were off. Bad time for this, isn't it? He said, followed with a soft and sneering laughter. I didn't answer this time, just simply because I didn't want to. The relaxation is gone. I was quite nervous, and a little bit scared. It seems like you forgot to tell me something. What? Your destination. The town I live is at the end of this road. You just need to stop when we get there. Fine. How far? I think we still need an hour. Then we can stay together for another hour. What do you mean? No offense, I mean you will be safe at home in an hour. Hey. What? Want to talk? Didn't know what was he thinking, but I know that he may get angry if I refuse his requirement. His anger may bring disasters on me if he is a dangerous person. Okay. This is a dangerous place and time to hitchhike, you know. I know. Your car had some problems, isn't it? It did. Need my phone to call for help. People are always wise when they imagine themselves in a dangerous situation. But if they are really in a situation like this, they don't know what to do. I didn't expect that he would give me such kind of help. At that moment, I relaxed my vigilance, which made me regret forever. Here, sure, thank you. The phone is in the bag inside the locker. Sorry I can't reach it for you cause I need to focus on driving. I opened the locker, the bag was inside. Again, I glanced him when I did this. He was still in the dark, didn't had a single movement. His hands are still holding the steering wheel, but it was very strange to me. Think that he had already kept that posture for 20 minutes. Why he didn't move? 2 months ago, someone found a body of a young hitch girl like you in the forest near this highway. I felt sick and was completely freaked out at that moment. He has already murdered 3 girls, all hitchhikers. The atmosphere in the car is becoming strange. I had a bad feeling about this, so I quietly put my hands on the door switch and hoped that the door wasn't locked. Jumping out would be my only way to escape if the guy beside me turns to a FICO. Are you scared? What do you want? My voice shivered when I spoke, fear crowded on my back, and I was ready to jump out at any second. Look behind. As soon as I did that, I flung open the car door and jumped out. The ground was hard and a sharp pain stabbed into my arms, but I know I'm safe when I saw that car drove straight ahead without stopping. Later, I was picked up by a police officer who coincidentally drove by. He told me that the story was true, and the man that night was highly suspicious. Told everything I could remember to them later at the police station. Several years have passed by now, but at every cold winter night, when the wind starts knocking at my window, I can still feel that man, like he is just right beside me. I couldn't forget the things I saw at the last few seconds. It will haunt around me forever. The driver was not the person at the driver's seat. He was already gone. That skinny, pale killer placed him there to keep the car going. Himself was hiding at the back seat, spoke to me all the time, and just waited patiently, with a giant smile on his face.